Okay, the problem tells us that our decedent is Darlene, and that Darlene had 3 children, Kathleen, Charles, and Clarissa. The problem also tells us that Darlene is survived by some grandchildren. It also, unfortunately, goes on and describes these people as being grandchildren of Darlene's children. That obviously is not possible. If they were grandchildren of Darlene's children, that would make them Darlene's great-grandchildren. It would also mean that we have an entire generation of people who aren't even named. So I'm not going to presume that's the right way to read this. I'm going to presume that they really mean that Darlene was survived by some grandchildren who are themselves the children of Darlene's children. So, for example, Kathleen has 2 children, not grandchildren. We've got Georgette, Georgina, something like that, and Greg, who are the children of Kathleen. And then we have Gunther, who is the child of Charles. Now, we are further told that Darlene, out of the child generation, Darlene was survived only by Clarissa. From that, we will deduce that Kathleen and Charles have predeceased Darlene, who of course is our decedent, so she's not there either. All right. Now, with regard to any distribution system, step 1 is to identify the starting generation. With regard to per capita at each generation, which under the Michigan Code is called representation, that generation would be the first generation with any living members. And the first generation with any living members, obviously, is going to be the child generation because Clarissa is still alive. All right. The next thing we do is we apply the rule. We do this no matter what the distribution system, but since you're only having to learn about one, we don't have to worry about that. But you always start by applying the rule, which is the initial step for the allocation of shares. So the rule says 1 share for each member of that generation, meaning the starting generation, then living, that would be Clarissa, and 1 share for each deceased member of the starting generation, leaving issue, then living. Well, Kathleen is deceased but left living issue, and same for Charles. So all 3 children are going to be allocated 1 share of Darlene's estate. We have 3 shares, and so for each of those 3 1/3 shares, we allocate 1 to each person in the starting generation who fits the rule. Now Clarissa, we give her her 1/3 share and we say bye-bye, thanks for playing, and she's gone, and we don't think about her anymore. We just don't even worry about her. All right. Now under per capita at each generation, the second step, after we've allocated shares at the starting generation, is the step that I call bundle and drop. We're going to take Kathleen's 1/3 share, and we're going to add it to Charles's 1/3 share to give us a combined share that's going to be 2/3 of the estate. Now, with that 2/3 share, we're going to treat it as though it is its own single entity, because it really is once we've bundled it. Now we have to go to the next generation, and we have to apply the rule again. Now this is a standard thing. Once you drop a generation, you apply the rule at that generation, treating that generation as the new starting generation for this division. So again, applying the rule, it's 1 share for each member of that generation, then living. Well, we don't even have to go to the second part because all the members of that generation are then living. Now, we count them up again, and there are 3. So each of them is again going to get a 1/3, but of what? Well, it's 1/3 of what we dropped down. So each of them will get 1/3 of that 2/3 share. And this is true despite the fact that each of them are in possibly different families. Now, you do the math, 1 times 2 is 2, and 3 times 3 is 9, and so each of them is going to get a 2/9 share of Darlene's estate, 1/3 having gone to Clarissa. Each of these 3 grandchildren will each get a 2/9 share. You can't reduce 2/9 any further, and so that is what it has to be. And so that's how you would write the answer, and that's where you would stop. If you could reduce the fraction, you can. I imagine you would probably get all the points that were available, even if all what you said was they each get 1/3 of the 2/3 share. The important thing is to notice that you bundled the shares of the deceased members of the starting generation, and then you took that fraction and drop it down and divide it per capita among each of the members of the subsequent generation without regard to the fact that they are descended from different branches of Darlene's children. Now, very briefly, so you can compare what we just did with a per stirpedal distribution, and this would be whether we're talking about modern per stirpes or strict per stirpes. If we were under per stirpes, we would have Darlene as our decedent again, and once again she would have 3 children, and there they are sitting there, and we would note who has additional children, of course. So we would have Georgette, and we would have Greg, or Georgiana, whatever her name is, and Gunther, and we have them coming down from their parents like that. And so first of all, we're going to kill off whoever is deceased, and so we get rid of everybody but Clarissa at that generation. Now again, we apply the rule just like we did before. 1 share for each member of that generation then living, 1 share for each deceased member leaving issue then living, and so again we have 3 shares in each of these children, whether alive or not, whether deceased and leaving living issue, we'll get a 1/3 share. Now, here's where the difference comes in. With regard to stirpedal distribution, you just pretty much act as though there's some sort of fence between these family lines once you've made that initial allocation. So you only take a 1/3 share and drop it down for Georgette and Greg, and each of them will get, then we do the rule, 1 share for each member of that generation then living. They're each going to get 1 out of 2 shares times that 1/3 that drop down, which means that each of them will get 1/6. Meanwhile, Gunther, being the only member of that generation then living, with regard to Charles's share, is going to get all of Charles's share. So under the per stirpes distribution, Gunther gets a 1/3 share all by himself, while Georgina, Georgette, whatever her name is, and Greg have to split that 1/3 share, giving them only 1/6 each. And that would be the difference.